The scorching summer sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky as Francine Galloway squinted at the broken wagon wheel, sweat trickling down her temple and disappearing into the collar of her dusty blue dress. The year was 1875, and the unforgiving Arizona Territory desert seemed determined to claim another victim as she stood helplessly beside her crippled wagon, miles from the nearest settlement. "Not now," Francine whispered, kicking at the splintered wooden wheel with the toe of her boot. "Not after everything." 3 months of traveling west from Boston had brought her to this desolate stretch between Tucson and the small mining settlement of Copper Springs. The death of her father had left her with nothing but debts and painful memories in Massachusetts, and the promise of a teaching position in Copper Springs had been her salvation, or so she'd thought until an hour ago, when the wheel had finally surrendered to the rough terrain with a sickening crack. Francine pushed back a damp strand of auburn hair that had escaped her once neat bun. At 24, she had weathered many storms, the loss of her mother to influenza when she was 12, the war that took her brother, and now her father's passing. But the thought of dying alone in this wilderness sent a chill through her despite the oppressive heat. She'd already gone through half her water supply, carefully rationing sips as she attempted to assess the damage. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was shattered beyond her ability to repair. One of the wooden spokes had completely splintered, and the iron rim had bent inward at an impossible angle. Francine shaded her eyes and scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of life. The flat, barren landscape stretched endlessly, punctuated only by scattered sagebrush and the occasional towering cactus. No sign of a town, a homestead, or even another traveler. Her horse, Penny, stood with drooping head, occasionally pawing at the parched ground. The poor creature had been pulling the wagon since dawn, and the water in its trough was running dangerously low. "What now, Father?" Francine whispered to the hot, still air. "You always had a plan." "What would you do?" The silence was her only answer. She checked her pocket watch. Nearly noon, the hottest part of the day approaching. She needed to find shelter, but leaving the wagon meant abandoning everything she owned in the world. A distant movement caught her eye, a plume of dust rising from the horizon. Francine's heart leapt, then immediately sank again. In this territory, a stranger could mean salvation or danger. The newspapers back east were full of stories about bandits, renegades, and worse roaming these parts. She straightened her shoulders and reached into the wagon, her fingers closing around the cold metal of her father's revolver. She'd never fired it at a person, had only practiced with tin cans behind their Boston home, but the weight of it provided a small comfort as she tucked it into the pocket of her skirt. The dust cloud grew larger, eventually revealing a single rider on horseback. Francine's grip tightened on the revolver as she watched the approaching figure resolve into a man on a chestnut stallion, moving at an unhurried pace across the desert floor. As he drew closer, she could make out more details: a broad-shouldered man wearing a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could tell he was studying her and her broken wagon with interest. 20 yards away, he raised a hand in greeting and slowed his horse to a walk. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice carrying easily across the dry air. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." Francine nodded cautiously, keeping one hand in her pocket. "My wheel broke. I was headed to Copper Springs." He brought his horse to a stop a respectful distance away and tipped his hat back, revealing a sun-weathered face with keen blue eyes. He wasn't as old as she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "That's a mighty long way to be traveling alone," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Preston Morgan's my name. Most folks just call me Prees." "Francine Galloway," she replied, not moving from her position by the wagon. His eyes flicked to her hand in her pocket, and a slight smile touched his lips. "Smart to be cautious, Miss Galloway. Not everyone you meet out here has good intentions." He reached for a canteen hanging from his saddle. "But I assure you I mean no harm. You look like you could use some water." Francine hesitated, acutely aware of her parched throat and the dwindling supply in her own water barrel. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan, but I still have some." "The desert doesn't forgive those too proud to accept help when it's offered," he said, holding out the canteen. "Please." Something in his steady gaze convinced her, and Francine slowly withdrew her empty hand from her pocket, accepting the canteen. The water was cool. He must have filled it from a spring recently, and she had to force herself not to gulp it greedily. "Thank you," she said, returning it after 2 careful sips. "Keep it," he said, waving away her attempt to hand it back. "I've got another." His attention turned to her wagon, and he circled it slowly, examining the broken wheel with practiced eyes. "You've got yourself a real problem here. That wheel's beyond patching." "I feared as much," Francine said, disappointment weighing on her shoulders. "Is there a town nearby where I might hire someone to fix it?" Preston shook his head. "Nearest town with a proper wheelwright is Tucson, and that's a good 30 miles back the way you came." He knelt beside the wheel, running his fingers along the splintered wood. "But I reckon I might be able to help you. I've fixed a wagon or 2 in my time." "You can repair this." Francine couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "Not here, not without tools and supplies," he said, standing and dusting off his hands. "But my ranch is about 5 miles northwest of here. I've got a workshop with everything we'd need." Francine bit her lip, considering her options, which were decidedly few. Stay here and almost certainly perish in the desert heat, or trust this stranger. "I understand your hesitation," Preston said, reading her thoughts, "but I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe. My foreman's wife, Martha, is at the ranch. She's been with me for years. You'd be welcome to stay in the guest room while I work on your wheel." "And then you'll bring me back to my wagon?" Francine asked. "Better than that," he said. "I'll fix the wheel, attach it back to your wagon, and escort you to Copper Springs myself. These are dangerous parts for a woman alone." The offer was too good to refuse, and Francine found herself nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I accept your help." "Good," he said with a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Let's get your horse some water before we go." Preston moved efficiently, helping her unhitch Penny from the wagon and giving the exhausted animal water from his own supply. He secured the wagon as best he could, covering the contents with a tarp he produced from his saddlebag. "Most folks respect other people's property out here," he explained. "Necessity is the only thing that might make a man steal, and there's nothing here that looks necessary for survival." Francine gathered her most valuable possessions: her father's pocket watch, her mother's locket, the teaching credentials that had secured her position in Copper Springs, and a small pouch of coins that represented her entire fortune. These went into a leather satchel along with a change of clothes. "Ready?" Preston asked, holding the reins of both horses. "As I'll ever be," Francine replied, accepting his help up onto Penny. They set off across the desert, the sun beating down relentlessly. Preston led the way, occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming the sparse vegetation they passed. Francine found herself studying him as they rode, the confident way he sat in the saddle, the broad set of his shoulders, the gentle way he spoke to his horse. There was something reassuring about his presence that she hadn't expected. "How did you come to be in this part of the territory?" she asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Came out west after the war, he replied, glancing back at her. Fought for the Union, saw too much death to go back to Pennsylvania. Wanted open spaces and a fresh start. And you found it here? Francine was genuinely curious. The barren landscape seemed an unlikely place for new beginnings. Found more than I was looking for, Preston said with a small smile. Won this land in a poker game 6 years ago. Previous owner thought it was worthless, too far from water, he said. But I found an underground spring my first week here. Been building it up ever since. A fortunate turn of luck, Francine commented. My pa used to say luck is just opportunity meeting preparation, Preston replied. And what about you, Miss Galloway? What brings a Boston lady to the Arizona territory? Francine was surprised he had placed her origin so accurately. How did you know I'm from Boston? Your accent, he said simply. Got a distinctive way of saying certain words. Plus, the quality of your wagon and clothes says Eastern City. You're observant, Mr. Morgan, Francine said, impressed despite herself. Yes, I lived in Boston all my life until 3 months ago. My father passed away last winter, leaving considerable debts. I sold everything to pay what I could, but there was nothing left for me there. I'm sorry for your loss, Preston said, and the sincerity in his voice touched her. Thank you. I secured a position as a schoolteacher in Copper Springs. They're building a new schoolhouse and wanted someone with formal education to teach the children. They're lucky to have you, he said. Not many qualified teachers willing to come this far west. As they crested a small rise, Francine gasped at the sight that greeted her. In the distance, nestled against the backdrop of rugged mountains, lay a green oasis in the desert, a sprawling ranch with several buildings, corrals filled with horses, and fields that appeared to be flourishing despite the harsh environment. Welcome to Horizon Ranch, Preston said, a note of pride in his voice. It's beautiful, Francine breathed, taking in the unexpected sight. How is it so green? That underground spring I mentioned feeds a small creek that runs through the property. With careful irrigation, we've managed to grow crops and raise cattle that others said couldn't survive out here. As they approached the ranch, Francine could see more details: a large main house built of sturdy timber, several outbuildings, a corral where cowboys were working with horses, and fields where crops grew in neat rows. It was a testament to human perseverance against the harsh elements. A woman emerged from the main house as they rode into the yard, plump, gray-haired, and wearing a flour-dusted apron. Preston Morgan. Who's this you've brought home? She called, wiping her hands as she approached. Martha, this is Miss Francine Galloway, Preston said, dismounting and helping Francine down from her horse. Her wagon broke down about 5 miles southeast of here. She's on her way to Copper Springs to be their new schoolteacher. Martha's weathered face broke into a warm smile as she took Francine's hands in her own. Lord above, you poor thing, out in this heat with a broken wagon. Come inside, dear, you must be parched and hungry. Before Francine could respond, she was being ushered toward the house, Martha's arm firmly around her shoulders. Frank, Martha called to a tall, lean man crossing the yard. Tell the boys to prepare the guest room, and Preston, don't you stand there gawking. See to the lady's horse. Preston tipped his hat with an amused smile. Yes, madam, I know my place. And don't you forget it, Martha retorted good-naturedly. This ranch would fall apart without me, and well you know it. Francine found herself smiling at the exchange as Martha led her into a surprisingly spacious and well-appointed home. The main room featured solid wooden furniture, colorful rugs, and shelves lined with books, more books than Francine had expected to see in a frontier ranch house. You like to read? Martha asked, noticing Francine's gaze. Very much so, Francine admitted. I didn't expect. A library in the middle of nowhere, Martha finished with a chuckle. That's all Preston's doing. Man reads more than anyone I've ever known. Now, you sit right here while I fetch you some cold tea and something to eat. You look like you're about to faint away. Francine sank gratefully into a comfortable armchair, the events of the day catching up with her. The cool interior of the house was a blessed relief after hours in the sun, and she found herself relaxing for the first time since her wheel had broken. Martha returned promptly with a tray bearing a pitcher of tea, a plate of biscuits, and sliced ham. Eat up, dear. Nothing worse than desert heat for sapping the strength right out of you. Thank you for your kindness, Francine said, accepting the offered refreshments. I'm imposing terribly. Nonsense, Martha said firmly. Preston wouldn't have brought you here if he didn't think you needed help, and we don't turn away folks in need. That's not how we do things at Horizon. As Francine ate, discovering she was ravenous, Martha bustled about, preparing the guest room and chatting all the while. Francine learned that Martha and her husband Frank had been with Preston since he acquired the ranch, that they had a son working as a doctor in Tucson, and that the ranch employed 8 cowboys full-time. Preston's built something special here, Martha said, pride evident in her voice. When we first arrived, there was nothing but a run-down shack and miles of seemingly worthless land. Everyone said he was a fool for trying to make it work. Yet he succeeded, Francine observed. That he did. Most determined man I've ever known. Once Preston sets his mind to something, wild horses couldn't drag him away from it. Martha paused, studying Francine with a knowing look. He's a good man, our Preston. Never known him to break his word or turn away someone in need. Before Francine could respond to the unspoken endorsement, the front door opened and Preston entered, his hat in his hands and his hair damp with sweat. Your horse is settled in the stable, he said to Francine. She'll be well cared for. I've had a look at your wheel situation, and I think I can fashion a replacement by tomorrow afternoon. So quickly? Francine asked, surprised. I keep seasoned wood on hand for repairs, he explained. The iron rim will be the trickier part, but our blacksmith is skilled. With luck, we'll have you back on the road to Copper Springs by the day after tomorrow. I can't thank you enough, Francine said earnestly, or pay you adequately, I'm afraid. My funds are limited. Preston waved away her concern. We'll worry about that later. For now, you should rest. Desert heat takes a toll, especially on those not accustomed to it. The guest room's ready, Martha interjected. Why don't you show her the way, Preston, while I finish preparing supper? Preston nodded and gestured for Francine to follow him down a hallway off the main room. It's not fancy, he said, opening a door to reveal a simple but clean bedroom with a pine bed, dresser, and washstand, but it should be comfortable. It's perfect, Francine assured him, stepping into the room. A quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed, and curtains of the same fabric framed the window that looked out over the ranch yard. Mr. Morgan, I truly appreciate everything you're doing for me. Preston, he corrected gently. Mr. Morgan was my father. Preston, Francine agreed with a small smile. Then you must call me Francine. Francine, he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. Rest now. Supper will be ready in a couple of hours. Martha's a fine cook, best food you'll find for 100 miles. After he left, Francine sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. She'd woken that morning with clear plans and expectations, only to have them completely upended. Now she found herself in a stranger's home, dependent on his goodwill and expertise. Yet, despite the uncertainty of her situation, Francine felt safer than she had in months. There was something about Preston Morgan, his quiet confidence, his straightforward manner that inspired trust. Or perhaps it was simply that, after months of traveling alone, the human connection felt profoundly reassuring. She unpacked her small satchel, hanging her spare dress in the wardrobe to remove the wrinkles. Then, using the pitcher and basin on the washstand, she washed away the dust of travel as best she could and re-pinned her hair into a neater arrangement. A light knock at the door announced Martha, bearing a fresh pitcher of water. "Supper in half an hour, dear. The men are cleaning up now." Her eyes twinkled as she added, "Preston's put on a clean shirt, must be making quite an impression." "Martha," Francine protested, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. The older woman just laughed. "Don't mind me, just an old woman's observations. Come out when you're ready." Supper was served at a long table in the dining room, with Preston at the head, Francine seated to his right, and Martha and Frank across from her. 3 of the ranch hands joined them: Tom, a taciturn man with a handlebar mustache; Miguel, a young Mexican cowboy with a ready smile; and Caleb, an older man missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The meal was abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch's garden. Conversation flowed easily as the men discussed the day's work and plans for the following day. Francine found herself drawn into their camaraderie, answering questions about her journey and her plans for the school in Copper Springs. "Teaching's important work," Preston commented as they enjoyed Martha's apple pie for dessert. "My mother was a teacher back in Pennsylvania. Always said education was the only true path to freedom." "She sounds like a wise woman," Francine said. "She was," Preston replied, a shadow crossing his face briefly. "Lost her to typhoid when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Francine said softly, recognizing the lingering pain in his eyes. "I lost my mother to influenza when I was 12. Their gazes held for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of shared grief that needed no further explanation. After dinner, the ranch hands excused themselves, and Frank and Martha retired to their quarters in a smaller building adjacent to the main house, leaving Preston and Francine alone. He offered her a tour of the grounds before darkness fell completely, and she readily accepted. The evening air had cooled considerably, making it pleasant to walk around the property. Preston showed her the stables, the corrals, the workshop where he would repair her wheel, and finally, the source of the ranch's prosperity, the spring-fed creek that gurgled merrily through a grove of cottonwood trees. "It's like finding diamonds in coal," Francine remarked, watching the clear water flow over smooth stones. "Water in the desert." "That's exactly how I felt when I discovered it," Preston agreed. They stood side by side in the gathering dusk, listening to the soothing sound of the water. The previous owner never bothered to explore the property fully. He just saw barren land and gave up. "His loss was your gain," Francine observed. "Life often works that way," Preston said thoughtfully. "One person's misfortune becomes another's opportunity. Like your broken wheel bringing you here." Francine glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "You consider my broken wheel fortunate?" A slow smile spread across his face. "For me, decidedly so. It's not often we get visitors at Horizon, especially ones with such interesting stories to tell." The compliment warmed her, and Francine found herself smiling back. "Well, I suppose there are worse places to break down than within riding distance of your ranch." "Much worse," he agreed. As darkness descended fully, he offered her his arm. "We should head back. Morning comes early around here." Francine hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his shirt. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, the stars beginning to appear in the vast desert sky above them. At her door, Preston bade her good night with a small bow that seemed at odds with his frontier surroundings, yet somehow perfectly suited to him. "Sleep well, Francine. Tomorrow we'll get you one step closer to Copper Springs. Thank you, Preston, for everything." After he left, Francine prepared for bed, her mind swirling with thoughts of the day's events. She had expected many challenges on her journey west, but she hadn't anticipated meeting someone like Preston Morgan, a man who seemed to embody the best qualities of both the civilization she'd left behind and the frontier she was embracing. As she drifted off to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, Francine wondered what the next day would bring, and why the thought of continuing to Copper Springs no longer held quite the same appeal it had just 24 hours earlier. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Francine dressed quickly in her blue calico dress, her second best, saved for important occasions, and pinned her hair in a simple but neat style before venturing out to the main room. Martha was already bustling about the kitchen, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "Good morning, dear. Sleep well. Come sit and have some breakfast. The men have been up for an hour already. Is there anything I can help with?" Francine offered, accepting a cup of strong coffee. "Not a thing. You're our guest," Martha insisted, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before her. "Preston's in the workshop already, determined to have that wheel of yours fixed by sundown." After breakfast, Francine found her way to the workshop, a sturdy outbuilding near the stables. The door stood open, and she paused in the entrance, watching unobserved as Preston worked. He'd removed his shirt in the already mounting heat, and Francine couldn't help but notice the play of muscles across his tanned back as he bent over a partially completed wagon wheel. The sight stirred something unexpected within her, a flutter of attraction she hadn't experienced before. Francine had had suitors in Boston, of course, proper young men in tailored suits who spoke of business prospects and family connections. None had affected her the way this frontier rancher did with just his presence. Realizing she was staring, Francine cleared her throat. Preston turned, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Francine, good morning." He quickly reached for his shirt, pulling it on but leaving it unbuttoned. "I've made good progress. The wheel's taking shape." "It looks complicated," she observed, stepping into the workshop and examining his work. The wooden spokes were arranged in a perfect pattern, waiting to be fitted into the hub. "It's a matter of precision," Preston explained, his hands demonstrating as he spoke. "Each spoke must bear equal weight, or the wheel will fail again at the first rough patch." "How did you learn to do this?" Francine asked, genuinely curious. "My father was a carpenter," Preston said, continuing his work as they talked. "He believed in knowing how to make or fix anything you might need. Out here, that philosophy has served me well." Francine watched him work for a while, admiring the skill in his hands and the concentration on his face. "Is there anything I can do to help? I feel useless standing idle while you work so hard on my behalf." Preston seemed about to refuse, then reconsidered. "Actually, if you're willing, I could use an extra pair of hands to hold these spokes in place while I secure them." For the next hour, they worked together, Francine following Preston's instructions as they assembled the wheel. His patience as a teacher impressed her, as did his ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms. By midday, the wooden portion of the wheel was complete, lacking only the iron rim that would give it durability. "Jacob, our blacksmith, is working on that now," Preston explained as they paused for a drink of water. "With luck, it will be ready by evening." "You've accomplished so much already," Francine said admiringly. "In Boston, this would have taken days at a proper wheelwright's shop." "Necessity breeds efficiency," Preston replied with a smile. "Besides, I had excellent help." He wiped his brow with a handkerchief, leaving a smudge of sawdust on his forehead. Without thinking, Francine reached up and brushed it away, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Preston went still under her touch, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The moment was broken by Martha calling them for the midday meal. Francine stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "We should," she began. "Yes," Preston agreed, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Martha doesn't appreciate being kept waiting." Throughout the meal, Francine was acutely conscious of Preston's presence across the table. Their conversation remained casual discussions of the ranch, her teaching plans, the journey ahead to Copper Springs, but something had shifted between them, an awareness that hadn't been there before. After the meal, Preston excused himself to check on the blacksmith's progress, and Francine found herself helping Martha with the dishes despite the older woman's protests. "Preston seems very capable," Francine remarked as they worked. Martha shot her a knowing glance. "That he is. Built this place from nothing through sheer determination. Could have had his pick of wives from the surrounding territories, but he's never seemed interested. Until now, perhaps." "Martha," Francine exclaimed, feeling heat rise to her cheeks, "you're imagining things." "Preston is simply being kind to a traveler in distress." "If you say so, dear," Martha replied, her tone making it clear she believed otherwise. "But I've known that man for 6 years, and I've never seen him work so diligently on a repair, nor look at anyone the way he looks at you when you're not watching." Francine busied herself with drying a plate, unsure how to respond. The idea that Preston might be interested in her was both thrilling and terrifying. She had come west to be a teacher, to build a new life for herself, not to lose her heart to a rancher she'd just met, no matter how compelling she found him. "I'm continuing to Copper Springs as soon as the wheel is repaired," Francine said finally. "They're expecting their new teacher by next week." "Of course," Martha agreed, but the twinkle in her eye suggested she wasn't convinced this was the end of the story. In the afternoon, Francine explored the ranch further, spending time in the stables checking on Penny, who seemed perfectly content in her temporary accommodations. She also discovered Preston's library, a small room off the main living area, filled with books on subjects ranging from agriculture and animal husbandry to classic literature and poetry. She was examining a volume of Wordsworth when Preston found her, his presence announced by the scent of leather and pine that seemed to accompany him. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Francine held up the book. "I wouldn't have expected Wordsworth in an Arizona Territory ranch house. Because cowboys are supposed to be illiterate," he teased gently. "No," she protested, then smiled sheepishly. "Well, perhaps I did have some preconceived notions that you've thoroughly disproven." Preston crossed to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines. "Books were my mother's passion. She believed they could transport you anywhere, teach you anything." He selected a volume and handed it to her. This was her favorite. Francine accepted the book, a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. "Mine as well," she admitted. "I've read it countless times." "Keep it," Preston said simply. "A gift." "Oh, I couldn't, please," he insisted. "My mother would have wanted it to be enjoyed, not sitting on a shelf gathering dust." The simple generosity of the gesture touched Francine deeply. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the book, and again that awareness flared between them. This time, Preston didn't look away. "Francine," he began, his voice low, "I know you've only just arrived here and you have plans for Copper Springs," but a shout from outside interrupted whatever he had been about to say. "Preston!" the rims ready for fitting. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering his composure. I should go. That's Jacob with your wheel's final piece. Of course, Francine said, clutching the book to her chest as if it could protect her from the confusing emotions swirling within her. Preston hesitated, then with a nod, turned and left the library. Francine remained, running her fingers over the book's cover, wondering what he had been about to say and why her heart was racing at the possibilities. The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly. Francine helped Martha prepare supper, learning that the older woman had once been a cook in a fine Philadelphia restaurant before marrying Frank and heading west. Never regretted it, Martha said firmly as she taught Francine how to make her special cornbread. The city has its comforts, but out here you can breathe. You can see the stars. You can be yourself without worrying what the neighbors think. Is that why you stayed with the ranch? Francine asked. For the freedom, partly, Martha admitted, stirring the batter vigorously. But mostly because of Preston. That boy needed someone to look after him when he first came here, thin as a rail and haunted by the war. Frank and I couldn't have children of our own, you see. Preston became like a son to us. The affection in Martha's voice was unmistakable, and Francine found herself even more curious about the man who inspired such loyalty. As the sun began to set, Preston returned to the house, his face streaked with sweat and soot, but wearing a triumphant expression. It's done, he announced. Your wheel is repaired and ready to be fitted to the wagon tomorrow. Wonderful, Francine exclaimed, genuinely pleased but also strangely disappointed that her stay at Horizon Ranch was coming to an end. How can I ever thank you? Join me for a ride after supper, Preston suggested. There's something I'd like to show you before you leave tomorrow. I'd be delighted, Francine replied, ignoring Martha's knowing smile behind Preston's back. Supper was a lively affair, with all the ranch hands joining them to celebrate the completion of the wheel. Stories were told, laughter shared, and Francine found herself feeling more at home than she had since leaving Boston. As the meal concluded, Preston caught her eye and nodded slightly toward the door. Francine excused herself, and minutes later, they were mounting horses in the stable yard, Preston on his chestnut stallion, Francine on a gentle mare he'd selected for her. Where are we going? She asked as they rode away from the ranch house, the last rays of sunlight painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. You'll see, Preston replied with a mysterious smile. It's not far. They rode in comfortable silence, the horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they followed a narrow trail that wound through the scrubland. After about 15 minutes, they crested a small hill, and Preston reined in his horse. Here we are, he said, dismounting and helping Francine down from her mare. Francine gasped as she took in the view. Below them lay a hidden valley, vibrant with greenery fed by a branch of Preston's precious creek. The setting sun cast a magical glow over the scene, turning the water to liquid gold as it meandered through a grove of cottonwoods and willows. It's beautiful, she breathed, enchanted by the unexpected oasis. My private retreat, Preston explained, leading her to a flat boulder that served as a natural bench overlooking the valley. When the responsibilities of the ranch become overwhelming, I come here to think, to remember why I chose this life. And why did you? Francine asked, settling beside him on the stone. Preston was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. After the war, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts, too many memories. I drifted west, taking odd jobs, gambling when I had to. I was lost, I suppose. And then you won the ranch, Francine prompted gently. And then I won the ranch, he agreed with a smile. A worthless piece of desert, according to the man who lost it. But the first time I rode out here to this very spot, I felt, At peace, for the first time since before the war. So you stayed, Francine said, understanding in her voice. So I stayed, found the spring, built the house, hired good people, created something from nothing. He turned to look at her directly, his eyes reflecting the last golden light of the day. What about you, Francine? What are you seeking in Copper Springs? The question caught her off guard with its perception. Seeking, I suppose, purpose, a fresh start. After my father died, there was nothing left for me in Boston. And you believe you'll find that purpose teaching in a mining town. His tone wasn't judgmental, merely curious. I hope so, Francine replied honestly. Education has always been my passion. The chance to shape young minds, to give children opportunities they might not otherwise have, it seems a worthy purpose. It is, Preston agreed. But Copper Springs is a rough place. The mining companies care little for education. They want workers, not thinkers. All the more reason the children need a good teacher, Francine countered. Preston smiled at her determination. You're a remarkable woman, Francine Galloway. The compliment warmed her, and Francine found herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. This complex man who quoted Wordsworth, yet thrived in the harsh frontier, who had seen the horrors of war yet created beauty in the desert. As if reading her thoughts, Preston reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I know we've only just met, but I feel as though I've known you much longer. Francine's heart raced at his touch. I feel the same way, she admitted quietly. The air between them seemed charged with possibility as Preston leaned closer. May I? He murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Instead of answering, Francine closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative but quickly deepened as Preston's arms encircled her. The warmth of his embrace, the gentleness of his touch, despite the strength she knew, he possessed, it all combined to make her feel both protected and desired in a way she had never experienced. When they finally parted, breathless, the sun had set completely, leaving only a faint glow on the western horizon. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky. That was. Preston began, then shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. Unexpected. Francine suggested with a small smile. Wonderful, he corrected, taking her hand in his. Francine, I know you have plans, commitments in Copper Springs, but, she prompted when he hesitated. But I find myself wishing you would stay, Preston admitted, his voice low and earnest. Here. At Horizon, with me. The invitation took her breath away. Preston, we barely know each other. I know enough, he said firmly. I know you're intelligent, brave, and kind. I know you face the journey west alone rather than accepting defeat in Boston. I know I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. What would I do here? Francine asked, struggling to think practically despite the emotions overwhelming her. You don't need a school teacher. Actually, we do, Preston replied, surprising her. There are 15 children within riding distance of the ranch, the children of my workers, neighboring ranchers, a few homesteaders. They have no school, no teacher. I've been considering building a schoolhouse, but without a teacher, it seemed pointless. You're serious, Francine realized, studying his face in the growing darkness. Completely serious, Preston confirmed. Stay, Francine, teach here. Be part of what we're building at Horizon. He paused, then added softly, be part of my life. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. In the space of 2 days, Horizon Ranch had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had, and Preston had awakened feelings Francine had never expected to experience. What about my position in Copper Springs? She asked. They're expecting me. I gave my word. I'll ride to Copper Springs tomorrow, Preston offered immediately. Explain the situation, help them find another teacher. There must be someone in Tucson or one of the larger settlements who could fill the position. His eagerness to solve the practical problems touched Francine deeply. This was no idle fantasy. Preston had clearly thought this through, was willing to go to considerable trouble to make it possible for her to stay. "You would do that for me. For someone you just met. For you," he said simply. "Yes," without hesitation. In that moment, looking into his eyes, Francine knew her decision was already made. The teaching position in Copper Springs had been an opportunity, yes, but Horizon Ranch in Preston offered something more: a home, a purpose, and the possibility of love. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. "I'll stay." The joy that transformed Preston's face was all the confirmation Francine needed that she'd made the right choice. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You won't regret it," he promised against her hair. "I'll make sure of that." As they rode back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, hands occasionally reaching across the space between their horses to touch, to reassure, Francine marveled at the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. A broken wagon wheel, a chance encounter in the desert, and somehow she had found not just safety but the promise of happiness. Martha was waiting on the porch when they returned, her knowing smile suggesting she had anticipated this outcome. "Well?" she asked as Preston helped Francine dismount. "Francine has agreed to stay," Preston announced, his voice filled with barely contained joy. "To teach the local children, Martha. We'll build that schoolhouse we discussed." "Is that all she's staying for?" Martha asked innocently, though her eyes twinkled with mischief. Francine felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but Preston merely laughed, his arm secure around her waist. "No, Martha, that's not all." "Well, it's about time," the older woman declared, coming forward to embrace Francine warmly. "Welcome to the family, my dear. I've been praying for someone like you to come along and put a smile on this man's face." Over the following days, Preston was true to his word. He rode to Copper Springs with a letter from Francine explaining her change of plans, and personally recruited a qualified widow from Tucson to take the teaching position. He returned with the woman's acceptance and the town council's understanding, along with Francine's wagon, now repaired and ready for travel. But Francine no longer needed it for a journey. Instead, the wagon's contents, her books, clothing, and the few keepsakes she'd brought from Boston were moved into the main house at Horizon Ranch, where Preston had cleared space in his library and bedroom for her belongings. Within a week of her arrival, construction began on the schoolhouse, a simple but sturdy building near the ranch house, designed with large windows to capture the desert light, and positioned to be accessible to children from surrounding properties. Preston insisted on overseeing every detail of the construction himself, often consulting Francine about her preferences and needs. "It's your domain," he told her as they stood watching the walls take shape. "It should reflect your vision for education." Word spread quickly about the new school, and families from miles around expressed interest in sending their children. By the time the building was completed a month later, Francine had a list of 22 prospective students ranging in age from 6 to 16. The opening day of school was a celebration for the entire community. Families traveled from as far as 20 miles away, bringing food and small gifts for the new teacher. Francine stood at the door of her schoolhouse, welcoming each child with a warm smile, feeling a sense of purpose and belonging she had never experienced in Boston. Preston watched from a distance, his pride evident in every glance. When the last child had entered and parents were preparing to leave, he approached her, taking her hands in his. "Happy," he asked simply. More than I can express, Francine replied, squeezing his hands. Thank you for making this possible. You made it possible, Preston corrected. I just provided the building. You're the one giving these children a future. As the weeks passed, Francine settled into life at Horizon Ranch, finding joy in both her teaching and her deepening relationship with Preston. They spent evenings in the library, reading aloud to each other or discussing plans for the ranch and school. They rode together on weekends, exploring the hidden beauties of the desert landscape. And each night, they parted at her bedroom door with increasingly reluctant goodbyes, honoring the propriety that both still valued despite their growing passion. 3 months after Francine's arrival, 3 months to the day, since her wagon wheel had broken in the desert heat, Preston suggested an evening ride to the hidden valley that had become their special place. As they sat watching the sunset, he took her hands in his. Francine, he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Mine as well, she assured him, touched by his vulnerability. When I found you in the desert that day, I had no idea how completely you would change my world. Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I know it hasn't been long, by conventional standards, but I've never been one to follow conventions. Francine's heart raced as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. Preston. I love you, Francine Galloway, he said, his blue eyes intense with emotion. I want to build a life with you, not just a school or a ranch, but a family, a future. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Francine's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, she finally managed. Yes, with all my heart. The joy on Preston's face as he slipped the ring onto her finger was all the confirmation Francine needed that her broken wagon wheel had been the most fortunate accident of her life. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony on the ranch, with Martha and Frank standing as witnesses, and the entire community gathering to celebrate. The schoolchildren formed an honor guard, throwing flower petals as Francine walked to Preston's side, wearing a cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her make. Judge Thompson, who had ridden from Tucson to perform the ceremony, pronounced them husband and wife as the desert sun cast a golden glow over the gathered crowd. When Preston kissed his bride, the cheers could have been heard for miles across the open landscape. The celebration continued well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army. As the stars came out, Preston led Francine away from the festivities and toward the main house, now their shared home in every sense. Are you happy, Mrs. Morgan? He asked as they paused on the porch. Completely, Francine assured him, reaching up to touch his face. I never imagined finding this kind of happiness, especially not in the Arizona territory. Sometimes the best things find us when we're not looking for them, Preston said, sweeping her into his arms and carrying her across the threshold. Like a Boston schoolteacher with a broken wagon wheel. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons, each day bringing new challenges and joys. The school flourished under Francine's guidance, eventually requiring an addition to accommodate the growing number of students. Preston continued to develop the ranch, implementing innovative irrigation techniques that allowed him to expand his crops and increase his cattle herd. A year after their wedding, Francine gave birth to their first child, a son they named William, after Preston's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, whom they called Elizabeth, honoring Francine's mother. Through it all, Preston and Francine's love only deepened, strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. They worked side by side, building not just a successful ranch and school, but a community that valued education, cooperation, and the kind of pioneering spirit that had brought them together. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting, Preston surprised Francine with a new wagon handcrafted in his workshop, with wheels he guaranteed would never break. "Not that I want you traveling anywhere without me," he teased as they stood admiring his handiwork, their children playing nearby under Martha's watchful eye. "Never again," Francine promised, leaning into his embrace. "My journey ended the moment you found me in the desert." "And mine began," Preston replied, kissing her with the same tenderness he had shown on that first evening in the hidden valley. As they walked hand in hand back to the house they had made into a home, Francine reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this life. A broken wagon wheel had seemed like disaster at the time, the final cruel blow in a series of misfortunes. Instead, it had led her to love, purpose, and happiness beyond anything she could have imagined. The desert sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the thriving ranch that was the tangible manifestation of their shared dreams. In the distance, the schoolhouse stood as a beacon of the future they were building, not just for their own children, but for all the children of the territory. Preston squeezed her hand as if reading her thoughts. "No regrets?" he asked, though the answer was written in every line of her contented face. "Not one," Francine assured him, returning the pressure of his fingers. "Every step of the journey led me here to you, even that broken wagon wheel." "Especially that broken wagon wheel," Preston corrected with a smile. "I thank God for it every day." As they reached their porch, William and Elizabeth ran to meet them, small faces alight with the joy of childhood. Preston scooped up their daughter while Francine embraced their son, and together they entered their home, a family created from chance, choice, and the kind of love that transforms lives. The Arizona Territory would continue to change around them. Settlements would grow into towns, territories would become states, and the frontier would gradually fade into history. But the legacy Preston and Francine built at Horizon Ranch, a legacy of education, innovation, and unwavering love, would endure for generations. All because a wagon wheel broke in the desert heat, and a cowboy gave a stranded woman water and the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined. 10 years after that fateful day, Horizon Ranch had become one of the most prosperous properties in the territory. The school had evolved into an academy that attracted students from as far as Tucson, with Francine serving as headmistress and employing 2 additional teachers. Preston had expanded his cattle operation and pioneered irrigation techniques that transformed desert land into productive fields, sharing his knowledge with neighboring ranchers and helping to build a thriving agricultural community. Their family had grown as well. William and Elizabeth were now joined by twin brothers, James and Thomas, lively 7-year-olds who had inherited their father's love of horses and their mother's quick minds. On the anniversary of their meeting, Preston and Francine still made time for a private celebration, riding to the hidden valley that had witnessed their first kiss and his proposal. On this particular anniversary, as they sat watching the sunset, Preston presented Francine with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, Francine found Preston's neat handwriting filling the first page. "The story of us. Begun the day a wheel broke and 2 lives became intertwined. For our children and their children after them, so they will know that the greatest journeys often begin with what seems like misfortune." Tears filled Francine's eyes as she turned the pages, finding the chronicle of their life together, from that first meeting in the desert heat to the growth of their family and the ranch, each milestone recorded in Preston's thoughtful prose. "It's beautiful," she whispered, looking up at the man who had become the center of her world. "When did you find time to write all this?" "Late nights, early mornings," Preston admitted with a smile. "Some stories deserve to be preserved, and ours is one of them." Francine asked, though she already knew his answer. "The most important one I'll ever tell," Preston confirmed, drawing her close. "The story of how a broken wagon wheel led to everything that matters." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their hidden valley, Francine rested her head on Preston's shoulder, content in the knowledge that their journey, unexpected, challenging, and beautiful beyond imagining, would continue unfolding, day by day, season by season, their love as constant as the desert stars now appearing overhead. And somewhere, packed away carefully in the attic of their home, the pieces of that broken wagon wheel remained a humble reminder that sometimes what appears to be the end of the road is merely the beginning of a far greater adventure.